Many stories, especially about small towns in the South, are told by outsiders and sort of fit tropes and stereotypes that we who are here understand aren't always true. And so we have to become narrators of our own communities.
Hi there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of The Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Gwen Frisbie-Fulton, a writer and storyteller in Greensboro, North Carolina. That was her voice you heard up top. She focuses on the stories of working-class people in the rural and small-town South. Stories, she says, are too often absent from discussions about the region. My interview with her is coming up later in the episode. Also, in our arts and culture segment, we'll talk about a new album by a Mississippi family band that has been decades in the making. But first, it's time for the weekly news roundup. And here, in the middle of Pride Month, it's a good time, and a necessary time, to consider the state of LGBTQ rights in the South. Obviously, the place to start is last week's ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that upheld Tennessee's ban on medical gender-affirming care for transgender people under the age of 18. The ruling in the case of United States v. Skermeti was not really a surprise. During arguments at the court in December, its conservative majority seemed sympathetic to the state's position that it was not discriminating against a protected group, but was merely seeking to protect children. Since I live in Tennessee and have been engaged in LGBTQ issues here for a while, I want to step back a little to talk about the arc of the past 10 years. In 2015, the Supreme Court heard another case about LGBTQ rights, Obergefell v. Hodges, which of course established a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. Tennessee was also part of that case. 4 same-sex couples here had sued the state over its discriminatory marriage laws, and their cases were rolled into the larger suit that went to the Supreme Court. One of those families came from Knoxville. Valeria Tanko and Sophie Jesty, 2 women who had been married in New York before moving to Tennessee, where their union was legally void. I was working at the time as communications director for the then mayor of Knoxville, Madeline Rohero, who was the only Tennessee mayor to sign on to an amicus brief on behalf of the plaintiffs. I remember Tanko and Jesty coming to visit the mayor's office with their newborn baby. When the landmark ruling in the case was announced, there was a joy-filled rally downtown to celebrate. My boss spoke, the local gay men's chorus sang, and there was a real sense of local pride that our city had played a role in establishing new civil rights protections for gay families. The Obergefell ruling put religious conservatives in Tennessee and elsewhere back on their heels for a little while. But it wasn't long before they regrouped and began pursuing a new tack in their efforts to reassert their visions of morality and gender roles. As transgender people began to attempt to assert their own presence and their own rights in the wake of Obergefell, they became a new and attractive target for the religious right. They are an even smaller minority than gay and lesbian people. Most estimates put trans people at about 1% of the total population, split about evenly between trans women and trans men. The vast majority of Americans, 90% or more according to surveys, know someone who is gay or lesbian, but only about 1/3 know someone who is transgender. That isn't surprising, first because there are numerically so few trans people, and second because it's only recently that many trans people have felt safe identifying themselves publicly. As was the case with gays and lesbians when social and legal norms forced many into secrecy, that lack of visibility and familiarity makes trans people an easy target for political scapegoating. The anti-trans movement has been strategic in picking its wedge issues, going after a handful of areas most likely to cater to public fears: sports, bathrooms, and the medical treatment of minors. So it wasn't a surprise that Tennessee passed a law in 2023 restricting gender-affirming care for trans minors. And given the makeup of the Supreme Court, which is now much more conservative than the court that delivered the Obergefell decision, it is not a surprise that it upheld that ban, and by extension, similar restrictions in 26 other states, which includes all of the southern states except for Virginia. Reacting to the decision in Tennessee, ACLU lawyer Lucas Cameron Vaughn said during an online news conference that it means transgender young people in the state will continue to have limited options for medical treatment.
Unfortunately, in Tennessee, this law forecloses a lot of the medical care that would be available to them. So luckily, our clients and a lot of trans youth in Tennessee have supportive families and have the privilege and ability to be able to take time off work and school to be able to go out of state to obtain medical care. But so many other young people do not, or do not have families that support them to try to assist them in getting that care from out of state. But the law in Tennessee forecloses a lot of medical care.
Still, advocates for trans rights took some comfort in the relative narrowness of the ruling, which did not directly address the degree to which transgender people in general are protected by anti-discrimination laws. Significantly, it was another case originating in the South just a few years ago that helped solidify some further levels of protection for LGBTQ people. In the Bostock case, decided in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that Clayton County, Georgia, had violated the civil rights of one of its employees when it fired him because he was gay. Some LGBTQ advocates had feared that the ruling in the Tennessee gender care case would signal a fence around the Bostock decision, meaning its protections would only apply to employment discrimination. But the Skermetti decision deliberately avoided that question, presumably leaving it to some future case to decide. If the South continues to lead the way in pushing anti-LGBTQ legislation, there are at least a few indications that the current post-Obergefell backlash may be cresting. In Florida, LGBTQ advocates recently celebrated what might have seemed like an unlikely victory a few years ago. According to the advocacy group Equality Florida, every proposed bill they had flagged as anti-LGBTQ in this year's state legislative session was defeated. Even more notable was how few of those bills there were, just 4. That was down from 22 introduced the previous year, of which only 1 passed. The bills proposed this year in Florida targeted the display of pride flags in public institutions, the discussion of LGBTQ issues in public workplaces, and diversity efforts in state and local governments. Proposals to ban pride flags in state and local agencies have also failed in Tennessee the last 2 years. Anti-LGBTQ efforts in Texas this year did not have quite the same failure rate as Florida, but according to the Texas Tribune, only 10 bills passed out of more than 100 bills filed to restrict LGBTQ rights. Among the new laws, a codification of the definition of the words male and female in Texas law, restricting them to people's sex assigned at birth, a requirement that insurance companies cover medical detransition care for transgender people if they cover transition care, and restrictions on a rural pediatric mental health care program forbidding its practitioners from providing services to treat young people for gender dysphoria. It may be that, for now, most Southern legislatures have caught up to each other in passing new anti-LGBTQ bills, and are just running out of rights to restrict without running directly afoul of federal civil rights protections. But new fights are no doubt looming. As the wave of trans panic legislation illustrated over the past few years, there can be great political gain for conservatives in successfully identifying and targeting vulnerable minority groups. And even with the protections of Obergefell and Bostock, LGBTQ people remain a vulnerable minority. One possible avenue is to directly attack those federal protections. There is widespread public approval of same-sex marriage, about 70% according to a 2024 Gallup poll. But that number has dipped slightly in recent years, presumably under the weight of the right-wing backlash. In fact, the drop is entirely due to self-identified Republicans. In 2022, their support for gay marriage rights had climbed to 55%, its highest level ever. But by 2024, it had fallen back to 46%. Sensing an opening, the conservative Southern Baptist Convention this month voted for the first time since the Obergefell decision to push for its reversal. Meeting in Dallas, 10,000 representatives of the nation's largest Protestant denomination strongly endorsed a resolution calling for the, quote, overturning of laws and court rulings, including Obergefell v. Hodges, that defy God's design for marriage and family. Southern Baptist leaders acknowledged that the Supreme Court decision presented a challenge. but they clearly hope that the current court majority might be willing to revisit a precedent, as they have been on several other issues. In order to challenge Obergefell directly, religious conservatives will need a state legislature willing to pass a law contradicting it. It's not hard to imagine which states they will look to. Okay, now we are to our interview. This is a good one. I really enjoyed talking to Gwen Frisbie-Fulton. As you'll hear, she's a social worker by training who in recent years has turned to advocating for social change and justice via her writing. I visited her at her home in Greensboro, North Carolina, a city known as an early battleground in the civil rights movement. Frisbie-Fulton's house is just a few miles from the Woolworth store where 4 black college students staged a sit-in 1960 to protest the segregated lunch counter. The store is now a museum that enshrines that history. But as Frisbie-Fulton knows, there are many ongoing stories of struggles and grace in the South, most of which go without any recognition. That's what she's trying to change, one story at a time. So Seth, let's go to the tape.
Gwen Frisbie-Fulton is a writer and organizer in Greensboro, North Carolina, dedicated to amplifying the voices of working-class people in rural communities. She is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has a master's degree from Valparaiso University. She has worked as an advocate and organizer with a variety of nonprofit organizations focused on issues including housing and food access. On her LinkedIn profile, she lists her pronouns as she, her, and y'all. With a deep commitment to racial justice and economic equality, her work is driven by a passion for challenging systemic inequities and advocating for the rights and dignity of poor and working-class people in the rural South. She is a regular columnist for Beacon Media, which provides content to newspapers across North Carolina, and you can find her writing many other places online, including a Substack called Working Class Storytelling. We will include links to those in the show notes. We are going to talk about the importance of storytelling in movements for justice and equality and the political dynamics of the rural South. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Gwen, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So can we start with a bit of your own story? Where did this obvious sort of deep felt commitment that you have to justice and equality, and also to kind of the voices of people who are often left out of those conversations, where did that come from for you?
I mean, I think, a lot of it comes from growing up with incredible family and surrounded by folks who told stories, who sat on front porches. Dinner time is a long, involved activity in my family home. And so we were always talking, we were always sharing, we were always inviting other people in, and we were always listening to each other. And as I got older, I realized that we don't always have places we get to tell our stories. There's structures and systems in place where people here in my neighborhood don't ever get to articulate their own experiences. And not only did that seem like a big loss for our culture and our community, but it also seemed like a huge injustice. That people can't, that people get stories told about them instead of getting to tell their own. So many years ago, I was actually living in the Midwest in Indianapolis, and I was living in a very poor, overwhelmingly white neighborhood called Fountain Square. And it's actually where my son was born. And while I was living there, a house a couple blocks away from me sold, and it was bought by what I learned was a white nationalist group. And they weren't from the neighborhood, but they moved into the neighborhood and turned this house to be their clubhouse. And they flew, a neo-Nazi flag outside. They sort of dressed as skinheads and would go around the neighborhood, tagging up the neighborhood with swastikas and causing mayhem. And what I realized is they'd come to the neighborhood to recruit people because it felt like a dead-end place, right? This was a very high poverty, very high unemployment neighborhood with a lot of problems. But I also loved my neighbors, and I loved myself, and I loved my kid, and it seemed grossly unfair that we had to deal with this group. And I became concerned because I knew that my type of family was exactly the type of family they were targeting for recruitment. So I actually packed up and left, and I moved down here to Greensboro to raise my son. The reason I'm sharing that story is because a few years later, I realized that I thought I'd made the right decision by my family to remove ourselves from that situation, but I realized I'd left everyone else behind. And I just sort of closed off that neighborhood from my life. And this was at the same time that Donald Trump was elected and was coming into power. And that neighbor who had bought that house and turned it into a white nationalist clubhouse, I actually saw his face in Charlottesville. He was there marching with yet a new group at this point. And I realized that he was more empowered and had a sort of direct line to power. Well, when he was in my neighborhood, he was a fringe character. He was a problem, but he seemed like almost like a holdover of a dying yesteryear. And he seemed reinvigorated in Charlottesville. And that was an incredibly political moment for me, where I decided that I wanted to become more involved in politics, but I was doing it out of a way of protection of my communities. I was thinking about all the little kids who still lived up in that neighborhood, who I'd saved my own kid, but I'd left behind to be recruited by this group. And I thought about the lack of voice that any of my neighbors had there. I thought about how little anyone knew about them. And I started to think about issues of politics, justice, and storytelling all as like one package.
You're especially focused on rural communities and small towns. And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about those places and the people who live in them. And we have the stereotype of the out-of-town reporter who flies in and talks to a couple of guys in MAGA hats at the diner. And of course, there's been criticism of that kind of parachute journalism and analysis. But you know, what's really going on in these communities? What is being missed by whether those stories are told by the left or the right or whoever's telling them? But what's missing from that picture?
Yeah. When I think about rural communities, and I think a lot about, I'm most familiar with North Carolina's rural communities. North Carolina's 100 counties. 85-ish are fully rural. Another 8 or 9 are sort of suburbanizing, sort of urbanizing, and then there's like 3 that are actually urban, counties. So it's a heavily rural state. And I became interested in rural North Carolina because I think 3 things are happening. We're very familiar with this story of economic divestment. We know that Wilkes County, North Carolina used to have incredible jobs in the furniture industry. And we know that those factories are gone, and, there's a Chick-fil-A and a Qdoba built where they used to be, and you can go in and order from somebody behind the counter, and they're like, yeah, I've worked here all my life. It just used to be a good job in this exact location, and now I'm doing this. So we know about that kind of divestment, and we know what happened from the 90s into the early 2000s and into now. And we know what that political backlash has looked like. So there's that kind of story of divestment that we're familiar with rural places. But we don't also think about this, the collapsing and divestment of local news, for example, into these communities. I work in counties and, where if they have a local paper, it's running once a week now. And it's just a few pages, and they've usually got some part-time staff. And these people are, valiantly trying to hold on and trying to keep some sort of news structure. But when you don't have local media, or when the TV news can't reach into the holler, they say, oh, that's an interesting story, but I can't go out there because we can't broadcast from there. you're lacking, one, that platform for people to talk to each other, but you're also losing the democratizing effects of media. Who's reporting on town council? And then the third way I think that rural communities have been divested in is politically. And I think that is on the right and the left. I think that the sort of traditional Republican Party has not done a good job in rural communities talking to folks. And, sort of famously, we say that the Democrats haven't. But I really see it as both sides. And what's happened is, into all those gaps that are created by all that divestment, is this far-right movements have really seen the opportunity to move in and try to lay seed. But in every town I go to, I also see a lot of people resisting that and pushing back. And we miss that story. We miss that story when we drop into a diner.
Well, and that actually gets to one of the stories I wanted to ask you about. You wrote a great piece, which we will link to, about the experience of a small community staple restaurant in Albemarle.
Oh, yes.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Albemarle. Mm-hmm.
That had started hosting drag shows to serve the local community, mm-hmm. and that then became the target of backlash and organizing by Proud Boys, who came in and kind of made an issue of it. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that story and the dynamic there? Because one of the things that struck me was that, groups like the Proud Boys tend to position themselves as being we're the defenders of traditional values and traditional small town values. But the actual people who lived in the small town, it was a beloved local resident, beloved local institution that had started hosting these drag shows. It was the Proud Boys who came in from outside, right, and brought their agenda with them. So yeah, can you just kind of tell that story a little bit?
Oh yeah, I think it's a really interesting story because it's all about flag planting, right? Where this born and raised Stanley County mom, small business owner, ran Tiffany's at the Boardroom, which was her bar and eatery down on the main street of this small town, beautiful little town, and she'd been there for years and, had her regulars, and had learned from her regulars that they were driving all the way to Charlotte for drag brunches, and they thought they were great. And she was coming out of COVID years running a restaurant and a bar, and was trying to figure out new models, and was just acting as a business owner, and was like, when you hear that local folks are going an hour and a half away for something, as a business-minded folk, you figure out, well, how can I get in on this? And so she decided she was going to have a drag show. And immediately she started to receive, really ugly messages and, threats from local Proud Boys, or claimed to be local Proud Boys. As best we can tell, one of them was local. And the rest were imported from all over the state, trying to shut this down. And, the way she talks about it is so refreshing, because she never saw herself as a political person. She was never taking a political stand. She saw herself as a businesswoman trying to figure out a new model to keep her business afloat after COVID, and that she was meeting local demand. She saw herself as a mom. She said she wasn't even sure if she was a Democrat or a Republican. This just wasn't her world. And all of a sudden she was being attacked as having an agenda. And what's so cool about it is she just stuck by her guns. She just went back on what her family had taught her, what she knew about her community, which is that you stand up for people, you don't act ugly. And as a business person, you try new things. And she insisted on holding this drag brunch. She ended up having an outpouring of support. And that's when I first ran into this story, is I'd heard that this was happening. I'd heard that the Proud Boys were planning on marching in the street outside of her business and trying to shut it down. And I drove to Little Albemarle, and the streets were absolutely packed with people supporting the drag show. and they came in from everywhere. And I think it's this idea where some of these far-right movements are trying to claim territory that isn't theirs. And just by sheer numbers game, Albemarle was clearly on the side of allowing a drag brunch to occur. And they were able to recapture back that narrative and mostly push the Proud Boys back out of town. And I just love it because I think local people, small town folks, just really regular people are doing that kind of work every day because they're refusing to get sucked into these sort of meta narratives that really, if they stop and pause, just don't describe their experience.
So that's obviously an example of your commitment to storytelling. And I want to talk about that word storytelling a little because it can sound a little, I think when you say storytelling, people kind of think of kids and maybe going to story time at the library and reading picture books and so forth. But obviously storytelling is a much broader thing, and it really encompasses an awful lot about how we learn about and experience the world. So how do you think of storytelling, and what are the ethics in your mind of storytelling? I mean, we think about journalism ethics in terms of getting facts and names right and so forth, but storytelling to me sounds a little more, really trying to tell somebody's story. You're taking on a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. What do I mean by storytelling? I use the word probably 40 times a day. I should probably come up with some succinct definition, but as a storyteller, I won't do that. I think that, stories, we live and breathe in stories, especially in the South. It's really the way folks communicate. It's the way it's the way we as parents describe caution and put boundaries around for our children. I was definitely told some spooky stories that probably kept me in the yard as a kid. And I've repeated that as a mom. We also relate to each other through stories. When my neighbor comes home this evening, he and I will, chat out in the front yards together, and we'll tell each other stories from our day. We'll laugh, together. And I think it's a really natural way for people to communicate, especially in the South. We are storytelling creatures down here. And I think sometimes that gets really lost. It gets lost in sort of marketing language, and it gets lost in when you tell people like, we just have to follow all the facts. And it's like, that's just not actually the way we operate. I like facts. They're cool, but it's really not the way we move through our day. And I think, but stories are. And so when I think about how that looks ethically, I would never claim to be a journalist. I'm not that rigorous. I'm also interested in how somebody is describing their own experience, their own organizing, their own family, their own community, and honoring that. So I sometimes use the phrase bottom-up storytelling or democratic storytelling, where it's more participatory, where I'm saying to somebody, this is what I'm hearing you say, and I'm saying it back to them, and then we're continuing on a conversation to make sure I'm getting it right, because I don't see it as my story. I see it as something that I'm bringing along for somebody who probably doesn't have a lot of access, who doesn't have a lot of opportunity to tell their own story. And I feel this sort of immense privilege to be able to maybe move their story in front of some eyes that wouldn't have seen it.
And how and why do you think storytelling can be important and powerful as a mechanism for, organizing, for building community movements and working toward change?
Yeah. I think the obvious answer is stories are activating our hearts, and maybe our minds as well. But we move with our hearts. We move through empathy. We move through connections. And what stories are doing is they're telling you that this stranger isn't that strange. This stranger and you have a lot of commonality. There's a lot of places you overlap. And through the process of telling stories, you're also creating a collaborative environment. So when you encourage somebody who is organizing in their own community to share their story when they talk to a neighbor, they're not doing that to convince them or persuade them of something. They're doing that to open a door for that neighbor to then tell them a story. And so it's sort of this long conversation that all good organizing should be. That's an invitation in, and there's a collaborative nature to it. That's really different than doing hard electoral organizing where you're giving a pitch, right? It's really different to do community organizing. It's slower. It's more broad and inclusive and expansive, and I think a story sort of sets the tone for that.
What do you look for in stories? What stories? Because obviously there are millions of stories out there. What draws you to a story and says, this is a story I want to know more about and a story that I want to tell?
Man, I'm a sucker for a working class hero. I just love people who are moving instinctually through their community and doing things because they just gutturally woke up knowing it was the right thing to do, versus somebody who feels super prepared and is highly trained for it. I just love somebody who is like, I am running into this fire and we're going to sort it out once we're in there. I just think that there's something so pure about that. I also love stories that are really surprising. Stories that are showing that we're all made of multiple parts.
So as a tool or an approach to social change and justice, what if there's somebody out there who is interested in this and thinks, yeah, that's a way I could contribute. That's something I could do, but I don't know how to. I don't know, how to start. What would you tell people to do? Where did you start?
Where I started is I'm a single mom, and I've always worked one or two jobs. And any parent knows that, you get off work and you come home and you have this short window of time to make dinner, maybe water the garden, probably not, bath time and bedtime. And those are precious moments. And then after all of that flurry of activity, you're then in the house and you can't leave because the kids are asleep. And so I longed for my life before being a mama, where I was involved in all kinds of organizing and activism, much of which happened for people in their 20s after 8 p.m. And very little of my life happened after 8 p.m. when I was 27 with a toddler. And so I realized that my contribution could be through writing. And I just would write Facebook posts and people would share them, and I was floored. But there's something that being a parent does for you where you do have to step back, and I'm so grateful for it, because you do have to become more of an observer. And I became really interested in seeing different people in my community and the amazing work that they were doing, and being able to be backed away from it enough to start seeing the connections from a slightly removed place. And what I would say to folks is that every town has so many stories to be told, and they're so important to be told, and who tells them matters. Many stories, especially about small towns in the South, are told by outsiders and sort of fit tropes and stereotypes that we who are here understand aren't always true. And so we have to become narrators of our own communities, historians of our own communities, and start documenting. And so I don't think it's about being, a lovely writer, and it's certainly not about punctuation. I stand by that. It is, but it's absolutely about like who has the mic and who's talking. And that's the work that I'm most interested in. I'm really interested in showing local people who are probably already doing this a little bit in their own communities, that posting on Facebook and narrating the community and your observations around you is a valid way of communication. You don't have to be on MSNBC. In fact, I'd rather you not be. And I think that people who are doing local organizing, whatever that looks like, whether you're running a community garden or you're helping your friend run for mayor, documenting and bringing more voices into that is never a bad move.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you is we're sitting in your living room, and out on your porch, I can see you have a banner that says "Better South."
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? What is a better South?
Yeah. I mean, I think the South's pretty darn good. Don't get me wrong. I really rebuke when people say, especially after an election, why do y'all still live there? Why don't you move? Why don't you come up here to this nice place? And I think to myself, we have so much to offer the rest of the country. We are, because things are so rough, because we wear everything on our sleeve in the South. Nothing's hidden here. We know what our history is. We know what the sides are. And still there's, hundreds and thousands and millions of people here in the South who every day are choosing to stay and do good things. I feel like it's better South is something we're actively building. I tell people from the North all the time, I'm like, y'all, we gave you Fannie Lou. We gave you Martin Luther King. We gave you the Tennessee Three. Like, these characters, these leaders, this culture can only come from a place that's this hot. And we just need other people to believe in us as well, and listen to what local folks are saying to realize that we're not these stereotypes. And we're certainly not the NCGA.
Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and love your writing, punctuation or not. it's terrific, and I think everybody should go give it a look. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Annie Caldwell grew up in West Point, Mississippi, where she still lives and runs a clothing store called Caldwell Fashions. West Point is a small town of 10,000 or so people located about 50 miles south of Tupelo. It has its own musical heritage. Blues giant Howlin' Wolf grew up just outside of town, and Motown singer-songwriter Barrett Strong was a native as well, along with 3 members of the 90s rock band Blind Melon. 50 years ago, in 1975, when Annie Caldwell was in junior high school, she and her brothers released a gospel soul album under the name The Staples Junior Singers, in tribute to the great Staples singers, although they are no relation. They only pressed a few hundred copies, and that was the end of Annie's formal music career, at least for a while. She married another musical talent, her guitar-playing husband, Willie Caldwell Sr. In the 1980s, their daughters showed an interest in singing, and a talent for it, too. But Annie and Willie were dismayed by the secular soul and R&B that their girls were drawn to. So they decided to provide them with what they considered a more righteous outlet. They formed a family band. Annie and the Caldwells features the matriarch on lead vocals, with her daughters singing call and response backup. The music is provided by Willie, along with their sons Willie Jr. on bass and Abel on drums. And they pack a wallop with soul disco grooves propelling the powerhouse voice up front. Annie Caldwell, as it happens, is a great soul singer in every sense of the word. Here's a taste.
I thought I was doing right. Then I realized I was wrong. But you kept me on.
That's Wrong, the lead-off song on the excellent new album Can't Lose My Soul, the band's major label debut. Although Annie and the Caldwells released 2 albums during the 2010s on Memphis-based Echo Records, the new album is their introduction to a mass audience. It came about because that original Staples Jr. Singers album had built up a cult reputation among gospel fans over the years, which eventually led to it being reissued by Luwaka Bop, the eclectic New York label founded by musician David Byrne. Luwaka Bop prevailed on the Staples Jr. Singers to reunite for a new record, Searching, which was released last year. The trio earned acclaim and toured widely. From there, the label moved on to Annie's current project with her husband and children. Can't Lose My Soul remains firmly planted in the family's faith. The title track is a 10-minute plea for salvation that builds in intensity as it goes. It's a terrific album that draws on deep musical and spiritual roots and still feels contemporary. Unlike the Staples Jr. Singers, Annie and the Caldwells are a working band that didn't need to be reunited, just recorded. And to get the sound just right, they recorded it at the Message Center, the church in West Point where they often perform during worship services. So the album is a document of not only a band and not only a family, but a very particular place and spirit. You can find it along with the Staples Jr. Singers recordings on streaming services and for purchase on the Luwaka Bop website. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.